Hey, it's Nick here. I'm going to show you today how to make your own knife. Excuse the background noise, my brother's welding a project together. I'm at my parents' house. But the first thing you want to do is come up with a design for your knife. This is just a design for a smaller bushcraft knife that I came up with. I just drew it out on some cardstock paper, cut it out with my scissors, and I'm going to trace it onto my steel. The steel I'm using here is from this industrial sized saw blade. I got this for free. I have a source where I can get these. You may not be able to get these or some type of saw blade, but you can order steel from Alpha Knife Supply for pretty cheap. And there's lots of other sources online to find knife making steel. But you have to use a high carbon steel. I've already contacted the company that manufactures these saw blades and found out that they are a high quality, high carbon steel, and I've made a few test knives out of these and they work really well. So, first thing you want to do is find a quality steel and design your knife, and now I'm going to trace my design onto the saw blade. Okay, for the next part, we're going to use an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel, a very thin cutoff wheel, to cut out the knife from our saw blade, to cut out the blank. When you're doing this, always wear eye protection and something like a respirator, if not at least a bandana, to protect your lungs. You do not want to permanently damage your eyes or your lungs. So, okay, that's hot, but okay, so that's still hot from cutting it out, but that's the general shape cut out with the angle grinder. Okay, next we're going to take the knife blank and move over to this station where I have a bench grinder set up and a belt sander. This is just a cheapy 4x36 belt sander from Harbor Freight. But you'll want to set up a water bucket to quench your steel in, because when you're grinding it gets really hot and you don't want to burn your hands. People may be concerned that I'm not using gloves while I do this, but I actually think gloves are a safety hazard. They can get caught in the machinery, and they can cause you more harm. Okay, now I'm going to be using the bench grinder to clean up the edges on the knife blank. It's just a rough cut from the angle grinder right now. Okay, once you get your shape for the blank all nice, how you want it, the edges are all even, you need a jig to grind the bevels on your knife. You can grind it by hand, but that takes a lot of practice. For your first few knives, I would suggest making a jig like this. This is just a piece of angled metal that I've drilled holes into, and these washers will hold the knife in place. So let me get the jig set up, and then I'll start grinding the bevels on the knife. Okay, so this is how the jig works. It bolts the knife to the angled steel, and then that holds it at the right angle, and I just grind back and forth on this belt sander in order to get the bevel for the knife. So I'm going to grind a little bit here. This is 50 grit sandpaper. I would suggest at least 50 grit, if not 40 or 36 grit will work for the initial grinds, and then you can move down to finer sandpapers as you go. But for the initial grinds, I would use 50 grit. So that's the start of the bevel there. Again, you want to quench in your water bucket. Try to keep that to the side, because this does get very hot. Okay, now I'm to the point where I want to switch sides on this jig to grind the opposite side of the knife here. What you want to do is gauge it. You want to grind to just before the halfway line in the thickness of the blade. And this knife is going to be 1/8 of an inch thick. So I want to grind down not quite 1/16 of an inch on this side. You want to leave a little bit of thickness in the center for when you heat treat it, otherwise it'll warp if you grind it straight to the point. So you can either mark that center line, score a line in there, or I can just eyeball it. That's what I do. But here's one side of the bevel completed. Okay, so I'm getting the bevels down where they're getting close to being even on each side. But what I've done is measured out how far up this bevel went, and I've marked it out on this side so that as I'm grinding I can try to match that so that they will be symmetrical. They will be the same on each side and they will look good. See, I'm leaving a little bit of thickness up here, and if I get it too thin like I have up here on the tip, I'm going to have to grind that flat again on the belt sander so that it won't warp during the heat treatment process. Okay, now I've got a finer grit belt on here. This is about a 220 grit. And I'm just using it to polish up the back spine of the knife here. I've also already used it to polish up each side of the bevel, and I have ground this flat again because it came to a point. I ground it flat, about 1 millimeter of thickness left in there so that it won't warp during the heat treat process. Okay, I got the knife all cleaned up. All the edges are pretty polished. I left some thickness here. I'm still going to clean this portion up with a Dremel tool, but I'll do that probably after the heat treat. Now I marked out where I'm going to drill my holes for the pins which will hold the wooden scales onto the handle. I'm going to use brass pins, and I already know the size of those pins. So I bought some cobalt drill bits. Those are meant for drilling through metal. You want cobalt drill bits, and you want to use a drill press when you're doing this. If you don't have a drill press, you could make it work with a hand drill, but it's a lot harder to keep it straight, and you will wear your drill bits out twice as fast. Okay, so I'm going to drill the holes in the tang of the knife. You want to use, like I said, cobalt drill bits, and you want to use some sort of cutting oil when you drill to preserve your drill bits. That will make your drill bits cut better and last longer. Make sure it's centered up. Nice and slow when you're drilling through steel like this, and make sure to keep it oiled. If you go too fast, you're going to dull your drill bits and they'll be useless after 1 or 2 holes. So take your time. One hole drilled. Okay, now I'm going to be heat treating the knife. What I'm going to use here is a little barbecue pit with charcoal in it, and I will use a hair dryer to blow the coals and get them hot enough to heat treat the blade. What you do is you get the blade to where it's red hot and you test it with a magnet. If it has become non-magnetic, then the blade is hot enough. At that point you will quench it in oil. So we'll let these coals get good and red hot. I've already got the knife in there. I don't know if you can see right there the tang of it. And I've got a piece of wire connected to it so I can pull it out easily. I'm letting it get hot with the coals so that it gradually heats up. I'm not going to put it straight into the red hot coals. Okay, so we'll let these get red hot, and then we'll get the blower on there and get ready to quench. Okay, so I've had the knife in here for a few minutes with the dryer on it, the air I should say. I can see that the blade is glowing like a cherry red, and it's pretty bright out here, so it's probably hotter than I might think it is. I'm gonna pull it out. I've got a magnet on the end of this piece of metal. I will test it, and I have some oil here to quench it in. It is non-magnetic. This is just a small canister of canola oil, which I find to be good for heat treating knives. Now, I didn't quench the tang of the knife right away. That's okay. The blade is the part that you want to be hardened anyway. Some people don't even quench the tang, like the last third of the knife, but I like to quench it. Okay, so that is the knife. I quenched it. I'm gonna just hang it up to dry, or kind of drip some of this oil off. Then I'll take it inside and clean it up. Okay, then you want to put the knife blade in the oven at 400 degrees for about an hour. That is to temper the blade and take some of the brittleness out of the blade. Okay, the blade has been tempered. Now I am just taking it on the belt sander with a 220 grit, and I am polishing the blade. It gets very black when you heat treat it, and I'm going to polish the blade. You can see I've already taken a lot of the blackness off the blade area. I should mention, if you want to keep a very straight bevel line, you should put it back in your jig in order to keep that straight bevel line. What I'm doing is I'm blending it almost to make it convexed a little bit, but it's still going to be a flat grind up through here. So I'm going to blend that. I do like the look of the straight bevel lines, but I just chose not to do them on this knife. Okay, so I've drilled out the holes for the wood scales. I've just got 2 brass pins holding the 2 scales together right now because I'm rounding off the top section, which is going to be closest to the blade, before I glue it. Everything else I can sand and shape after it's been glued. Okay, before I glue the scales on with epoxy, I like to get it set up, because I like to get it all set up to where I can just put the glue in and then clamp it, because I use a 5-minute epoxy and it tends to set up real quick on me. Okay, so you can see what I was talking about there. I've got a gap, and I'm just using Gorilla 5-minute epoxy. It's a 2-part compound. You don't need very much. Excuse the noise. noise. My dad is riding his motorcycle and my brother's using an air compressor. Okay. Seems like everybody has to start doing all kinds of stuff when you're trying to videotape something. So I can see down there and I'm making sure there's enough epoxy in there to glue everything together nice and good. Now, I'm going to move over to the vise. Okay, now I'm going to put it in the vise to set up, and I'm going to use 2 little blocks of wood. And that will help the pins be able to go all the way through. There. Now that's a 5-minute epoxy. It says it sets in 5 minutes, but I'll leave it for a few hours before I even think about sanding anything. Okay, so you can see I've been working the handle down with the belt sander here. It's still pretty rough. I've got a ways to go. But this is Peruvian walnut that I'm using for the handle. I used brass pins. The first 2 are 3/16 inches thick. The last one is a tube, and it's a 1/4 inch for a lanyard. It's starting to look pretty good. So I'll keep working it and show you the progress. Okay, now I'm going to take one of my old, from my belt sander. I've already stripped it down a few times, but one of the belts got torn. And so I just take a piece of that, rip it down, and then you can use it to kind of strop, or I don't know what the word is, but it's like you're taking it like you're shining a shoe, and you can go and it'll round the back of the wood really nicely. Okay, this is what I use to treat the handle. I've sanded this. Started with about a 220 grit, then went to a 320, 400, and a 500 grit. Now I'm going to oil the wood up with the boiled linseed oil, and that will make the wood look prettier, and it will also protect the wood. So that is how to make a knife. I used pretty basic tools. I know a lot of people don't have things like belt sanders and drill presses, but those are things that are going to help you a lot if you are going to get into knife making. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. I know I enjoyed making it, and I'm going to enjoy testing this knife out in the bush. Thanks, and I'll be back soon with another video.